You know, there's a kind of quiet unease that can creep in when we're faced with the really extreme side of human behavior. It's not just the shock of what someone did, but it's this deeper, more nagging question that we don't always say out loud. How can a person do something so terrible and yet seem so completely and utterly normal?
And that question, that paradox, is really the beating heart of Christopher Berry Dee's chilling work. It's the very thing that forces us to look past the easy headlines and actually try to understand the inner workings of a mind that just doesn't have the same guardrails the rest of us do. Things like empathy. We're talking about a mind that can look you right in the eye, make you trust it, and at the same time feel absolutely nothing for you.
Welcome to Daily Book Insight. Now, we're definitely stepping into some dark territory today, but our goal here is not to sensationalize any of this. Instead, we're here to understand. We want to look at the mechanics of the mind as they're described by a man who spent decades talking directly to these individuals, trying to map a landscape that, thankfully, most of us will never have to see for ourselves.
So, to explore this kind of territory, you really need a guide with some pretty uncommon experience. So, who exactly is the person who decides to walk into maximum security prisons to have these kinds of conversations?
The book we're drawing from today is Talking with Psychopaths and Savages. And what's so crucial to get is that this isn't some abstract theoretical book. It is built from the ground up on decades of direct, first-hand research. We're talking conversations, letters, and face-to-face interviews with convicted killers.
What gives Christopher Berry Dee his authority here is his really unique background. He started out as a Royal Marine intelligence officer, and a role like that really sharpens your skill for dispassionate observation, especially under pressure. From there, he became this world-renowned investigative criminologist, and even founded the Criminology Research Institute. But, and this is the most important part, his insights don't come from textbooks. They were forged in direct interviews with over 30 serial killers. This is a man who has literally sat across the table from the very minds he's trying to explain, and that gives his work a kind of rare and, frankly, unsettling authority.
Okay, so the very first and maybe the most crucial idea that Berry Dee brings to the table, it answers that question we started with. How do they seem so normal? He and others in his field, they have a name for it. They call it the mask of sanity.
So the mask of sanity, it's not just about telling a few lies here and there. It's a whole performance, a carefully built, meticulously maintained personality. It's this convincing front of normalcy, of charm, of all the things we expect to see in a person. But underneath that mask, as Berry Dee explains, there's an inner world that's defined by what's missing. Any real connection to the emotional lives of other people. It's not that they don't get emotions on an intellectual level. In fact, they can be brilliant mimics. It's that they just don't feel them. There's just an emotional void.
This split is just so key to understanding it. On the surface, what you and I and their victims see is this glibness and charm. We might even see someone who's apparently successful, someone who seems perfectly normal, maybe even exceptionally confident. But Berry Dee's interviews, they peel back that layer, and they show us what's really there. The charm? It's just a tool to hide that emotional void. The success? It's often built on a total lack of empathy for anyone they used to get there. The normalcy is a performance with a manipulative goal, and that so-called confidence is really rooted in a deeply overinflated and yet incredibly fragile ego.
Now here's a point that gets misapplied all the time, and Berry Dee is super clear about it. Not all individuals with psychopathic traits are violent criminals. Actually, far from it. Many of them use that charm, that lack of fear, and that intense focus on their own goals to become, say, very successful surgeons, CEOs, or politicians. This book isn't just a profile of killers, it's an analysis of a whole personality structure. The key difference is that while a lot of people might have one or two of these traits, the clinical psychopath has a whole cluster of them, and it's combined with that profound lack of empathy. So what do we do with an insight this heavy? Well, this isn't about running around trying to diagnose people. It's really just a tool for better observation. So here's your first action. Sometime this week, just notice one single instance where someone's really charming words don't quite seem to line up with their actions or the final outcome. The goal here isn't to judge or to confront them. It's just to quietly observe the gap between the mask and the reality. Think of it as a personal exercise in learning to see past the surface in our own daily lives.
All right, so if the mask of sanity explains how these individuals can go undetected for so long, the next insight from Berry Dee really digs into the why. What makes the mask crack? What can push someone from just having these traits to actually committing an act of violence? He points to a very specific psychological mechanism, what he calls the narcissistic trigger.
From all his direct experience, Berry Dee came to this conclusion. He found that narcissistic personality disorder is, in his words, inextricably linked to psychopathy. He says both types are characterized by exaggerated feelings of self-importance. And he saw this pattern again and again in his interviews, this grandiose sense of self, a desperate need for admiration, and an ego that was somehow both massive and incredibly fragile at the same time.
And this, he argues, creates a sort of path to violence. It starts with this fragile, overinflated ego. It's the very foundation of the mask of sanity. The person's entire sense of who they are is built on this feeling of being superior. Then something happens that challenges it. It could be something small, like a minor public insult, a rejection, losing a job, anything that feels like a loss of control. For this specific type of pathology, that challenge is just intolerable. It threatens to show the emptiness underneath the mask. And that's when violence becomes a tool. It's a desperate, horrifying way to grab back that feeling of power and put the world back in its proper order, with them at the top.
And again, it's so important to get the nuance here. The book is not suggesting that anyone with a big ego is dangerous. That's a huge misreading. What it's highlighting is a very specific pathology where the ego isn't just part of their personality, it is their personality. It's like a hollow structure that needs constant validation from the outside just to keep from collapsing. When that validation is threatened, the internal void is exposed and the reaction can be extreme. So it's not just about the size of the ego, it's about the fragility.
This brings us to a second, more internal kind of action. Look, we all have an ego. So the next time you feel that strong, immediate, defensive reaction to some criticism or feedback, just pause, just for a second. Before you say anything, just quietly ask yourself, is my ego just bruised here, or is there a real, actual issue that I need to deal with? It's a simple, private little check-in that helps us separate a wounded ego from a genuine problem. It's just a good practice for managing our own internal triggers. After looking at these really extreme examples, it's so easy to build a thick wall between them and us. But the real power of a book like this comes when we use it not just to understand others, but to hold up a mirror for a moment of quiet self-reflection.
You know, from my own experience, I know it's easy to put on a small, harmless mask of confidence on a day when I'm just not feeling adequate, or to let my ego drive a decision at work because I really don't want to admit I was wrong. These things are, of course, miles and miles away from the pathology we've been talking about, but the seeds, that desire to be seen a certain way, the sting of a bruised ego, those are universally human.
And that, right there, is the real value of looking into this kind of darkness. The book shows us an extreme, but the roots of ego and the desire for approval, those are things we can all recognize in ourselves, just on a much smaller scale. And what this comparison really shows is the critical importance of the one thing the psychopathic mind is missing: empathy. Empathy is the guardrail. It's what keeps these common human traits from spiraling into something destructive. It's that ability to feel with someone else that really puts on the brakes.
So, after this pretty difficult journey into these minds, what's the ultimate takeaway? What's the one thing that protects us and that defines our humanity when we contrast it with what we've just explored? After all the interviews, all the analysis, all the chilling stories, what this journey ultimately reveals is something pretty profound. The opposite of this dangerous mindset isn't just goodness or niceness. It's something more specific and way more powerful. It's empathy. It's that simple, resonant ability to understand and share the feelings of another person that stands as the fundamental barrier against that void that Berry Dee describes.
If there's one thing worth remembering, real growth begins when an idea is quietly applied, not loudly admired. If this insight gave you a new perspective, a like is always appreciated. Be sure to subscribe to Daily Book Insight for more. And you can also download the free one-page action plan from today's session to keep these ideas with you. Thank you for joining me.